What would drive someone to orchestrate the theft of 13 specific paintings worth nearly $500 million, only to leave behind works worth twice as much? Why would professional thieves with obvious insider knowledge of a museum's security systems spend exactly 81 minutes inside, the precise gap between automated security checks? And most puzzling of all, why would the world's most notorious art thief, a man who had eluded international authorities for over a decade, risk exposure by leaving his calling card at the scene? The answers to these questions would lead investigators not to a typical art heist motivated by profit, but to a 50-year-old fraud that had built one of America's most celebrated art collections on a foundation of lies, stolen genius, and a suicide that had silenced the truth until now. This is the story of the Harrington Heist, a crime designed not to take art, but to expose the greater crime hidden beneath the surface of 13 masterpieces. The Harrington Institute of Fine Arts stood as a monument to beauty on the Connecticut coast, its limestone facade illuminated by floodlights cutting through the misty rain. For decades, its marble halls had sheltered priceless treasures from war, weather, and theft. But no security system, regardless of sophistication, can protect against the human element. Jason Miller, a 25-year-old former art student with more passion than direction, sat at the security desk in the main monitoring room. His lanky frame hunched forward as he alternated between checking camera feeds and stealing glances at the sketchbook hidden beneath the monitor. 3 years ago, Jason had been considered a promising talent at Rhode Island School of Design before dropping out when his mother's medical bills consumed his tuition money. Now he guarded the masterpieces he once dreamed of creating. But tonight, his mind wasn't on art or security. It was on Giovanni Accardi and the $30,000 he owed the man. 2 months earlier, desperate to cover his mother's hospice care, Jason had accepted an invitation to a private poker game at Mata Azzurro, Accardi's upscale waterfront restaurant. What began as a desperate gamble became a spiraling debt that grew with each failed attempt to win his way out. Last week, Accardi's men had made it clear payment was expected, or alternative arrangements would be made. Down the east corridor, Adrian Raymonte paced with mechanical precision. At 32, the former military man moved with deliberate economy, every step measured. Unlike Jason's disheveled appearance, Adrian wore his uniform with pressed perfection, every button aligned, every fold exact. They were an unlikely pair, Jason with his unkempt hair and constant talk of obscure bands, Adrian with his pressed uniform and measured silence. The security desk phone rang, startling Jason. It was Eliza Woodward, the curator, calling to check that everything was quiet after the festival. Her voice carried its usual crisp authority. Jason assured her all was clear, just rain and more rain. As he hung up, Jason noticed Adrian had returned, standing just inside the doorway, his face expressionless. When Jason mentioned Woodward's call, Adrian noted that the museum had acquired a new piece yesterday that hadn't been announced yet. His expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes as he shared this information. Outside, the rain pounded harder against the windows. In the distance, thunder rolled across Long Island Sound, momentarily drowning out the building's gentle hum of climate control systems. Neither man noticed the black sedan that pulled into the service alley behind the museum, its headlights extinguished moments before entering the camera's field of view. The knock came at 7 minutes past 1. 3 sharp raps against the staff entrance, deliberate, authoritative. On the security monitor, Jason saw 2 police officers standing at the door, their faces partially obscured by the rain and the brim of their caps. The taller one leaned into the intercom, identifying them as Westport Police, responding to reports of suspicious activity around the perimeter. Jason glanced at the silent alarm panel. Nothing had been triggered. When Jason asked if he should call this in, Adrian studied the monitor with narrowed eyes and reminded him that standard procedure was to verify their badges before opening any doors. But Jason was already reaching for the door controls. His mind flashed to the warning he'd received last month when he'd followed protocol too rigidly and made the museum director wait in the rain. He couldn't afford to lose this position, not with what he owed to Cardi. Against Adrian's caution, Jason justified opening the door by reasoning that if something were actually wrong and they made the police wait, they would both be in trouble. The door unlocked with a heavy click as Jason overrode him. What happened next would haunt the art world for decades. The two officers stepped inside, water dripping from their dark blue uniforms. The taller one, Officer Sullivan, according to his nameplate, removed his cap, revealing cold eyes that swept the security area with practiced efficiency. Sullivan thanked them for letting them in, his Boston accent thick but measured, explaining they had received a call about someone testing the perimeter sensors on the north side. Adrian replied that their alarms hadn't triggered, standing slightly straighter, his military bearing evident. The second officer explained that was precisely why they were there. It could be someone testing response times before the real attempt. Sullivan then asked them both to step away from the security desk, gesturing toward the center of the room and explaining it was standard procedure when checking for system tampering. Adrian hesitated, his hand drifting slightly toward his belt, where the security radio was clipped. He expressed that he should call this in to their supervisor first. Sullivan smiled thinly and indicated they could wait, but as Adrian reached for the phone, the second officer moved with startling speed. The butt of his gun connected with Adrian's temple with a sickening crack, sending him crumpling to the floor. Sullivan dropped any pretense of authority as he leveled his weapon at Jason's chest, announcing this was a robbery. The younger thief moved behind the security desk, his actions quick and practiced as he disabled the alarm system with expert precision. His fingers flew over the keyboard, entering override codes that even Jason didn't know existed. Sullivan announced they had 81 minutes and not a second more, checking his watch as he spoke. Only then did Jason fully grasp the precision of the operation. 81 minutes, the exact gap between the museum's automated security check-ins with the monitoring company. The thieves weren't just prepared, they had insider knowledge of the museum's most sensitive protocols. When Jason stammered that the safe was time-locked, Sullivan's laugh cut him off, informing him the vault wasn't their target. The younger thief produced zip ties and duct tape, ordering Jason face down with hands behind his back, his voice clinically detached. As Jason was forced to the floor beside Adrian's unconscious form, his thoughts raced to Giovanni Party. Had his desperate confessions about the museum's security during their late-night discussions about his gambling debts led to this? They dragged both men to the basement storage area, a windowless room filled with crates and packing materials. As the door closed, plunging them into darkness, Jason heard Sullivan's voice echo from the corridor, directing his partner to start with the Dutch room on the second floor, reminding him they were on the clock. Upstairs, the thieves moved through the gallery with purpose. Unlike common art thieves who grab the most recognizable or valuable pieces, these men had a list. Sullivan went straight to the Dutch room, where he carefully removed The Harbor Storm by Hendrik van Neer, the artist's only known seascape, from its ornate frame. His partner entered the adjacent gallery, removing the 17th century masterpiece, The Music Lesson by Johannes Verhelst, from its mount with equal care. But what they did next confused later investigators. They ignored the crown jewel of the collection, Tiziano's The Divine Beauty, valued at over $90 million. And instead took 5 sketches by French impressionist Renaud, a lesser-known Chinese bronze vessel, and a decorative eagle finial that, while historic, was worth a fraction of other nearby treasures. In total, they selected 13 pieces, a specific 13. At exactly 2:26 a.m., they finished loading the last of their targeted pieces into unmarked art carriers. 1 minute before the scheduled security check-in, they exited through the same staff entrance they had entered, disappearing into the storm like ghosts. Detective Sophia Reyes had been with the Art Crimes Division for 8 years, but she'd never seen a scene quite like this. Rain continued to fall as dawn broke over the Harrington Institute, the soft morning light filtering through the museum's grand windows to illuminate what was now a crime scene. Yellow police tape cordoned off the Dutch room, where empty frames hung like wounds on the walls. At 42, Reyes had built her reputation on an almost preternatural ability to understand the psychology behind art thefts. Her colleagues attributed it to her dual background in criminal psychology and art history. She knelt to examine a nearly invisible glass fiber on the marble floor beneath one of the empty frames. To her partner, Detective James Morales, she explained they had cut the canvases out, noting the clean edges indicated professional work. Morales, a former beat cop who transferred to art crimes just 6 months earlier, wondered why they hadn't taken the frames too. Reyes explained it was about time and noise, but added that leaving them creates a more dramatic statement. The thieves wanted them to feel the absence. Near the entrance to the gallery, paramedics were examining Adrian Raymonte, who sat stoically despite the nasty contusion on his temple. Jason Miller paced nearby, his nervous energy palpable as he repeatedly ran his hands through his already disheveled hair. Reyes approached them, notepad in hand, introducing herself as Detective Sophia Reyes from the Art Crimes Division. She explained she needed to understand exactly what happened last night. Adrian spoke first, his voice steady despite his injury. He recounted how 2 men impersonating Westport Police Department gained entry at approximately 1:07 a.m., claiming to be responding to a perimeter alarm. He described how they knew exactly what they were doing. They disabled the cameras, knew the security check-in schedule, and had a list they checked off methodically. Reyes turned to Jason, whose nervous energy set off immediate alarms in her investigative mind. She questioned why he opened the door without verification. Jason swallowed hard and claimed he thought they were real cops. Reyes could see there was more to it, in the way he avoided direct eye contact, the slight tremor in his hands. 8 years interviewing suspects had taught her to recognize the signs of someone holding back information. Before she could press further, Eliza Woodward approached, her normally impeccable appearance showing signs of haste. At 58, Woodward had been the Harrington's chief curator for over 2 decades, building its collection from respectable to world-class. Woodward informed Reyes they had completed the initial inventory. When Reyes asked what they were looking at, Woodward handed her a preliminary list, explaining 13 pieces were missing, with a total value of approximately $450 million, though several were effectively priceless. Reyes scanned the list, her trained eye immediately noting the pattern, or lack thereof. She read aloud some of the stolen works: Van Meer's The Harbor Storm, Verhelst's The Music Lesson, 5 Reno sketches. Then she questioned why they left the Caravaggio and Tiziano's Divine Beauty. Woodward confirmed those pieces were worth more than everything they took combined. Confusion evident in her voice. Reyes murmured, more to herself than the others, that they had a shopping list, very specific targets. As the day progressed, Reyes methodically built her understanding of the crime scene. The thieves had been inside for exactly 81 minutes, a precise window between security checks. They had known exactly which pieces to take and which to ignore. They had understood the museum's security protocols intimately. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was a mission. In her unmarked police vehicle, Reyes sat for a moment before starting the engine. She reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small notebook. Not her official one, but a personal journal bound in worn leather. She flipped to a page marked with a red tab and stared at the symbol sketched there. A small wolf's head, drawn with precision. 3 years earlier, she had encountered that symbol for the first time in Barcelona. It had been left behind after the theft of 3 paintings from a private collection, the calling card of a thief known only as Damien, the Wolf Blackwood. What had begun as a routine investigation soon became an international manhunt that consumed her professional and personal life. Her obsession with capturing him had cost her everything. Her marriage to fellow detective Carlos Reyes dissolved under the strain. Her position at Interpol lost after she violated jurisdictional protocols. Eventually, she had returned to the States in what her former colleagues viewed as professional exile. The last communication she'd received from Blackwood had been a handwritten note left at a Barcelona warehouse, empty except for his calling card and the words, "Better luck next time, detective." The Harrington theft didn't match Blackwood's known pattern exactly, but something about its precision, its specificity, raised the hairs on the back of her neck. Later that afternoon, in the cramped office of the Art Crimes Division, Reyes pinned 13 photographs to her caseboard, images of the stolen artworks. Beside them, security camera stills showed the last footage captured before the system went dark. Her phone rang, the secure line used only for confidential informants. It was a male voice, disguised by what sounded like a voice modulator. The caller knew she was working the Harrington case. He told her to check Frankfurt, 2003, and Prague, 2004, noting the same MO and same precision. When she asked why he was telling her this, he advised that she was looking at the art when she should be looking at the frames. The line went dead. Reyes turned to her computer and began searching international databases for art thefts in Frankfurt and Prague. The results made her sit back in her chair, mind racing with implications. In both cases, specific pieces had been targeted, frames left empty. In both cases, the thieves had posed as authorities, and in both cases, the art had never surfaced on any known black market. But something else connected them. Something that sent a chill through Reyes despite the office's overactive heating system. In both unsolved cases, a single name appeared in the peripheral investigation: Damien the Wolf Blackwood. The evening after the heist, Westport's social elite gathered at Mar Azzurro, the waterfront restaurant that served as the crown jewel of Giovanni Accardi's legitimate business empire. Despite, or perhaps because of, the museum theft dominating local news, the restaurant was filled to capacity. The wealthy and connected drawn together to share theories and gossip about the crime that had shaken their community. In his private office above the dining room, Giovanni Accardi observed the scene through one-way glass, his expression unreadable. At 46, he projected the perfect image of a self-made success story. His security consulting firm occupied the top floor of a renovated warehouse in Westport's trendy harbor district. Below it, Mar Azzurro served overpriced seafood to the town's elite. His salt and pepper hair and tailored Italian suits completed the picture of legitimate prosperity. Few people knew that Giovanni's business empire was built on a foundation of gambling operations and protection rackets that stretched from Connecticut to Massachusetts. Fewer still knew about his mounting debt to the Calabrese family in Naples, a debt that had recently escalated from troubling to life-threatening. The phone on his desk rang. He knew who it would be before picking up. Answering with a carefully controlled voice, Giovanni heard the heavily accented voice on the other end, reminding him that he had missed yesterday's payment. The caller warned that the Calabrese family was losing patience. When Giovanni attempted to explain that he needed more time because of his investments, the voice cut him off, stating they didn't care about his investments. He had 30 days, after which they would collect in blood what he couldn't deliver in cash. The line went dead, leaving Giovanni staring at the phone in his hand, the knot of dread in his stomach tightening. Just then, his assistant Marco knocked on the door, announcing that Theodore Maxwell was there to see him. Giovanni straightened his tie, composing himself before instructing Marco to send him in. The door opened to admit a tall, gaunt figure that seemed to belong to another era. At 73, Theodore Maxwell moved with the deliberate grace of someone conserving energy. His tweed jacket and Oxford shoes spoke of old money and older traditions, while his piercing blue eyes betrayed an intelligence that had made him both respected and feared in the art world. Maxwell greeted Giovanni, his aristocratic Boston accent making even a simple greeting sound like a judgment. He inquired whether Giovanni had seen the news. Giovanni gestured to the visitor's chair and acknowledged that it was hard to miss, with the whole town talking about it downstairs. Maxwell remained standing, his gaze sweeping the office with casual assessment. He asked what the town was saying about Giovanni's security firm's connection to the museum. Giovanni moved to the bar cart in the corner, pouring 2 fingers of scotch into crystal tumblers, explaining there wasn't one officially, as their contract had ended 2 years ago, though it wouldn't stop people from speculating. Maxwell finally took a seat, accepting the offered drink with a nod. He observed that speculation fueled small towns and markets, noting that art prices were already responding. The conversation that followed would appear perfectly innocent to any observer. 2 businessmen discussing market fluctuations and insurance implications of a high-profile theft. What remained unspoken was the true purpose of their association, a plan years in the making that had finally been set in motion. As Maxwell rose to leave 30 minutes later, he paused at the door. He revealed that the Calabrese situation had been handled. Giovanni froze, asking what Maxwell meant. Maxwell explained that his associates had acquired Giovanni's debt, and the transfer documentation would be in his email by morning. His expression remained impassive as he described it as payment for Giovanni's consulting services regarding the museum's security infrastructure. When Giovanni carefully stated that he didn't understand exactly what he was being paid for, Maxwell replied it was for information already provided. Giovanni's conversations with young Mr. Miller about the museum's security protocols. These had proven quite valuable. The color drained from Giovanni's face as he realized Maxwell had set him up. Maxwell corrected him, stating he merely capitalized on an existing relationship, which had now served its purpose. Giovanni's debt to the Calabrese family was cleared. His financial problems were over. When Giovanni inquired about Miller, Maxwell assured him Miller would be taken care of, though he suggested Giovanni not attempt to contact him, for everyone's safety. After Maxwell's departure, Giovanni returned to the window, watching the older man's vintage Jaguar pull away from the curb. He had been played expertly, but the overwhelming relief of escaping the Calabrese debt overshadowed any anger he might have felt. Below, in the restaurant, his guests continued their evening of fine dining and speculation, unaware that one of the central players in the drama they discussed was watching from above, a man who had unwittingly helped orchestrate the perfect crime. Reyes wasn't expecting anyone. At nearly midnight, a visitor was unusual enough to put her on alert. She moved to the door, checking the peephole before opening it with surprise. It was Carlos, her ex-husband, standing in the hallway wearing the familiar worn leather jacket that had been his trademark during their marriage. At 45, Carlos Reyes still carried himself with the same quiet intensity that had first attracted her to him at the police academy 15 years earlier. He apologized for coming by so late, holding up his FBI credentials to indicate this was official business. She stepped aside to let him enter, confusion mixing with the instinctive tension that had characterized their interactions since the divorce. She questioned since when the Bureau made house calls at midnight. Carlos took in the crime scene photos spread across her dining table with a knowing glance. Some things hadn't changed. Her obsessive thoroughness, her inability to leave work at the office. He explained they had identified the vehicle from the Harrington Heist, which was found abandoned at a truck stop in New Jersey, wiped clean. Reyes commented on how fast this discovery was, and Carlos agreed it was too fast, almost like they wanted them to find it. As she opened the file he brought, a photograph slipped out. The recovered vehicle, a black sedan with damage to its rear bumper. But what caught her attention was what had been left in the back seat, a small card bearing a familiar wolf's head insignia. Her breath caught as she recognized Blackwood's calling card. Carlos nodded grimly, explaining that's why he was there. When Blackwood's name came up in connection with the Harrington case, the Bureau decided to bring him in as liaison, given their history with him. When Reyes questioned his use of "our history" with an edge to her voice, Carlos clarified he meant her knowledge and his jurisdiction. The Harrington theft had just gone federal. If Blackwood was involved, this was connected to something bigger. For the next hour, they fell into a familiar rhythm, sharing information and building theory as if the 3 years of personal estrangement had never happened. Carlos summarized what they knew. Miller had gambling debts to Accardi, who previously handled museum security. Accardi had suspected ties to organized crime. Then there were these specific 13 artworks taken, pieces that didn't make sense from a market value perspective. Reyes added Blackwood's calling card to the list of evidence. Carlos observed it was a complex web, too complex for a simple theft. As dawn approached, they had constructed a preliminary theory. Miller had likely provided inside information to Accardi, perhaps under duress due to his gambling debts. Accardi had the connections and knowledge to execute the heist, but the Blackwood connection remained elusive. Carlos gathered his notes, explaining he needed to go. He would coordinate with her department officially in the morning for a joint task force. At the door, he paused, cautioning Sophia to be careful. If Blackwood was really involved, she knew how dangerous he could be. After he left, Reyes returned to her caseboard, adding the new information. Her history with Blackwood wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. He had become her white whale, the case that defined and nearly destroyed her career. And now, after 3 years of silence, he had surfaced again. Or someone wanted her to think he had. Either way, the game was back on. The following morning, Reyes returned to the Harrington Institute. The museum had reopened, visitors crowding around the empty frames. The museum director, Marcus Harrington III, had insisted remain on display. Eliza Woodward met Reyes in the Dutch room, now roped off from the general public. When Reyes pointed to the empty frame that had once held the Harbor Storm and asked if anyone had adjusted it since the theft, Woodward assured her that absolutely not. Marcus had been explicit that nothing was to be touched. Reyes noted it was crooked, just slightly, unlike the others. With grudging permission, Reyes carefully removed the frame from the wall. At first glance, there was nothing unusual, just an empty gilded frame, its center showing the clean cut where thieves had removed the canvas. But as she turned it over, she noticed a nearly imperceptible alteration to the frame's backing. A small section had been cut and reattached. Inside was a small piece of paper bearing a familiar insignia, a wolf's head, and 6 numbers: 11, 24, 56. Reyes told Woodward she needed everything they had on this painting: provenance, acquisition records, conservation reports, everything. An hour later, Reyes sat in the museum director's opulent office. Marcus Harrington III was the grandson of the museum's founder, a man who had inherited position rather than earned it. Harrington greeted her with practiced cordiality, asking if she had found something of interest. Reyes placed the paper with the wolf's head and numbers on his desk, asking if November 24th, 1956 meant anything to him, or the name Lucien Maxwell. Harrington's expression remained unchanged, but Reyes caught the slight tightening around his eyes, as he claimed neither meant anything to him. He was lying. Reyes was certain of it. That evening, as she continued her research, her cell phone rang, a blocked number. The voice on the other end was distorted by a modulator. The caller directed her to Grand Central Station, locker 1024, explaining that the key was hidden behind a loose brick in the alley wall behind her apartment building. 3rd from the bottom, 5th from the left. Before she could respond, the line went dead. An hour later, Reyes stood in Grand Central Station, the key from the hiding place turning smoothly in locker 124's lock. Inside was a leather journal, its pages filled with meticulous notes dated from 1950 to 1956, signed by Lucien Maxwell. The final entry, dated November 24, 1956, revealed that MH had threatened exposure if Maxwell didn't cooperate with attribution changes. According to the entry, no one would believe a mere restorer over his reputation. The Vermeer technique Maxwell had pioneered would be credited to Harrington in the following month's Journal of Art Conservation. Maxwell described it as his life's work, stolen like the paintings Harrington claimed to have discovered, lamenting there was no escape from this. Accompanying the journal was a photograph, old black and white image showing a group of men standing beside crates being loaded onto a truck. The photo was dated June 1952. One of the men was clearly identifiable as a younger Marcus Harrington. Beside him stood another man, whose face had been circled in red pen. On the back was written, Lucien Maxwell, before the suicide. As Reyes carefully photographed each page with her phone, the implications became clear. The Harrington collection, or at least part of it, might have been built on forgery, false attribution, and the systematic destruction of Lucien Maxwell's reputation and work. Reyes received another call from the same modulated voice, requesting she meet someone at the bench across from the Bethesda fountain in Central Park in 1 hour. The night was cool and clear, the fountain illuminated dramatically against the darkness. Reyes approached cautiously, scanning for threats, her hand near her concealed weapon. An elderly man sat alone on the bench, his gaunt figure wrapped in a heavy overcoat despite the mild temperature. As she drew closer, he greeted her as Detective Reyes. his aristocratic Boston accent immediately identifying him as Theodore Maxwell. He thanked her for coming. Reyes, remaining standing, accused him of manipulating the investigation from the beginning and demanded to know why. Maxwell explained that justice, through conventional channels, wasn't possible. He gestured to the space beside him, asking her to please sit, as his condition made looking up rather uncomfortable. Reyes hesitated, then sat, maintaining distance between them. She stated that he had orchestrated the theft of 13 paintings worth nearly $500 million. Maxwell corrected her, explaining he had orchestrated the revelation of a fraud worth far more than money. Those 13 paintings were created by his father, Lucien Maxwell, commissioned by Marcus Harrington Sr., who then claimed them as discoveries of historical works. When Reyes asked if the journal was genuine, Maxwell confirmed every word. He explained his father was a genius, whose techniques could perfectly recreate the styles of historical masters. Harrington had exploited that talent, then threatened to destroy him when he objected to the false attributions. When his father was driven to suicide, Maxwell was 9 years old. He had found his father's body. Maxwell opened a thin leather portfolio and handed her a series of documents, correspondence between his father and Harrington, technical analyses of the paintings showing identical methods and materials across supposedly different historical periods, and sworn statements from art world figures who had suspected the truth but remained silent. He explained he had spent 50 years gathering this evidence, waiting for the right moment, developing the resources and connections necessary to reveal the truth in a way that couldn't be dismissed or buried. When Reyes mentioned Blackwood, Maxwell smiled thinly, revealing that Damien and he had an arrangement spanning 15 years. Blackwood possessed certain specialized skills in recovering misattributed art, skills that had proven invaluable in documenting the true origins of his father's work. Reyes inquired about the location of the 13 paintings, to which Maxwell replied they were somewhere safe, but their location was irrelevant to what happened next. He explained that Marcus Harrington III was planning to donate the entire collection to the Metropolitan Museum, cementing his grandfather's fraudulent legacy permanently. That could not be allowed to happen. Reyes asked why Maxwell had involved her, rather than just publishing his evidence. He explained that evidence from a vengeful son could be dismissed, but evidence discovered by law enforcement through legitimate investigation carried weight that could not be ignored. He added that her history with Blackwood suggested a certain flexibility in her approach to justice, a willingness to see beyond rigid procedures to the deeper truth. Maxwell closed his portfolio and returned it to his coat, revealing that pancreatic cancer had spread to his liver. His doctors gave him 3 months at most. This was his final act, the restoration of his father's legacy, and the exposure of the fraud that destroyed him. When Reyes asked what he wanted from her, Maxwell told her to present the evidence as she found it and follow where it led. Whether she revealed his involvement was her choice. By the time any consequences reached him, he would be beyond earthly justice. He explained that his father's journal ended with a hope that someday, someone would see what lies hidden beneath the surface. He asked her to be that someone. As he stood to leave, he turned back with one more thing she should know. The 13 paintings would resurface eventually, under their true creator's name, but not until the art world was ready to acknowledge the truth of their origin. 3 days later, Reyes and Carlos sat in his hotel room, surrounded by the evidence she had found. Carlos repeated their findings. Art, fraud. The 13 stolen pieces were created by Lucien Maxwell in the early 50s, then falsely attributed to various masters by Marcus Harrington Sr. Reyes added that the deception went deeper. Harrington had systematically constructed elaborate, false histories for each piece, fictional previous owners, fabricated documentation of their existence in historical collections, even manufactured conservation records, supposedly dating back centuries. Carlos concluded it was a fraud of unprecedented scale and sophistication, with the upcoming Metropolitan Museum donation about to cement it permanently. Reyes pointed out that the heist wasn't about stealing art for profit, but about preventing these fraudulent works from being enshrined in the Metropolitan's collection under false attribution. Carlos noted that Theodore Maxwell had been gathering evidence for decades, waiting for the right moment to expose the fraud that drove his father to suicide. When Reyes asked how Blackwood fit into all this, Carlos explained he was the specialist, the one with the skills to execute the heist and the connections to make the evidence public without being dismissed as a crank. Carlos considered the implications, wondering where the paintings were now. Reyes expressed doubt they would find them, explaining that was never the point. The point was to create a spotlight on these specific works, to make investigators look closer at the frames, the provenance, the history. The art itself was just a means to an end. Carlos concluded that end was the exposure of Marcus Harrington III and his grandfather's fraud. They needed to confront him with this evidence. The Harrington Institute's private conference room exuded old-world elegance, with wood-paneled walls and leather chairs that whispered of privilege and tradition. Marcus Harrington III sat at the head of the table, the very picture of cultured authority in his bespoke suit. He greeted Agent Reyes, Detective Reyes, and their distinguished colleagues with practiced cordiality, inquiring if they had been conducting additional research into certain pieces from their collection. For the next 45 minutes, the team methodically presented their findings: multispectral imaging revealing hidden signatures, pigment analysis confirming 1950s origin rather than historical creation, the technical assessment establishing single authorship across supposedly diverse works, and finally, the documentation connecting all 13 pieces to Lucien Maxwell. As the presentation progressed, Harrington's carefully maintained facade began to show cracks. His posture stiffened, his breathing pattern changed, and the slight tremor in his hand, as he reached for his water glass, betrayed growing distress. He finally interrupted, declaring their findings preposterous. He insisted these works had been authenticated by the foremost experts in their respective fields, and had been exhibited worldwide, studied by generations of scholars, and accepted universally as authentic. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the Smithsonian's chief art conservator, calmly explained that no one had examined them with these specific techniques before, as multispectral imaging at this resolution wasn't widely available until recently. Without cause to suspect forgery, no one would have looked for hidden signatures beneath the visible surface. Carlos added that the evidence was conclusive, explaining that all 13 pieces were created by Lucien Maxwell in the early 50s, then falsely attributed to historical masters through elaborate provenance fraud orchestrated by Harrington's grandfather. Harrington's face flushed with anger as he defended his grandfather as a visionary collector and patron of the arts, whose contributions to cultural preservation were beyond question. He characterized their accusations as not just false but defamatory. Reyes countered evenly that they were presenting scientifically verified facts, reminding him they had Lucien Maxwell's journal, correspondence between his grandfather and Maxwell, and historical records establishing the actual timeline of events. When Harrington demanded to know what they wanted, Reyes stated simply that they wanted the truth acknowledged. She explained that when the remaining works were donated to the Metropolitan Museum the following week, they should bear Lucien Maxwell's name as the artist, with appropriate historical context explaining their creation and significance. Harrington responded incredulously that they were asking him to destroy his family's legacy by publicly declaring his grandfather a fraud. Carlos clarified they were asking him to correct a historical injustice. When Harrington challenged them about what would happen if he refused, Carlos replied that the evidence would be presented publicly. The FBI's Art Crime Division would issue a formal report. The Metropolitan Museum would be legally obligated to withdraw the acceptance of the donation, pending resolution of attribution questions. And the media would inevitably frame this as the greatest art fraud of the century. Harrington stood abruptly, his hands visibly trembling. He declared the meeting over and stated his attorneys would contact them regarding these slanderous accusations. As he stormed from the room, Reyes exchanged glances with Carlos. They had anticipated resistance, but Harrington's categorical rejection suggested a confrontation rather than resolution was imminent. That evening, as Reyes entered her apartment, she immediately sensed something was different. Her hand moved instinctively toward her weapon as she scanned the living room. A voice from the darkened kitchen doorway apologized for the unannounced visit, explaining that some conversations are best had in person. A man stepped into the light, elegant, composed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to moving through the world on his own terms. He introduced himself as Damian Blackwood. Reyes noted that breaking and entering was still a crime, though she moved her hand away from her weapon. Blackwood corrected her, calling it a professional courtesy visit between colleagues. When Reyes directly asked what he wanted, Blackwood said he wanted to ensure she understood what was at stake. He handed her a printed email sent an hour ago from Harrington's private account to the museum's head of security, ordering the remaining works moved to a secure storage facility that night, away from the authentication team's access. Reyes realized he was hiding the evidence. Blackwood explained that Harrington believed this was temporary, but he didn't realize the game had already reached its conclusion. He moved to her dining table, where he laid out several photographs, explaining that Theodore Maxwell had anticipated this reaction. Each painting had been prepared with a special conservation treatment that would reveal Lucien Maxwell's signature permanently if the works were moved without proper stabilization procedures. Reyes pointed out this was tampering with evidence, though without much conviction. Blackwood countered that it was ensuring the truth couldn't be buried again. He explained the conservation treatment was harmless to the paintings themselves. It simply accelerated a natural process that would eventually have revealed the signatures anyway, perhaps decades from now. When Reyes asked why he was telling her this, Blackwood replied with unexpected sincerity that she deserved to know the full scope of what she'd been part of. Her role wasn't just professional, it was moral. As he moved toward the door, he paused to add one more thing. The young guard, Jason Miller, had been provided with a new identity, sufficient funds to start over, and admission to a prestigious art program in Europe. His debt to Accardi had been cleared. When Reyes inquired about Accardi and his connections to the Calabresi family, Blackwood explained that Theodore Maxwell was a man of considerable resources and influence. The debt had been transferred and neutralized, and Accardi would face no repercussions from Naples. His expression hardened slightly as he stated they were not in the business of ruining lives, only restoring justice where conventional methods had failed. After Blackwood left, Reyes sat at her dining table for a long time, contemplating the complex morality of what had transpired. The heist had been illegal, unquestionable, but the outcome, exposing a profound injustice, restoring credit to an artist whose work had been stolen, aligned with her fundamental commitment to truth. Her phone rang. Carlos calling to inform her Harrington was moving the remaining paintings that night. He was assembling a team to secure them as evidence before Harrington could hide them, with a court order being processed. Reyes confirmed she would meet him there. The scene at the Harrington Institute shortly before midnight felt like déjà vu. Law enforcement vehicles, official personnel, moving with purposeful efficiency. The museum once again transformed into a crime scene. Inside, they found museum staff already preparing the paintings for transport. Marcus Harrington III supervised personally, his composed facade replaced by obvious anxiety as law enforcement entered. Harrington objected that this was private property when Carlos presented the court order, claiming these works were being moved for legitimate conservation purposes. Carlos questioned the timing. At midnight, without notifying the authentication team that had been working with them for days. He informed Harrington that the court didn't agree with his assessment, and the paintings were now evidence in a federal investigation. As the agents began documenting the paintings, something unexpected happened. Under the gallery lighting, faint lines were becoming visible on several of the canvases, lines that formed the distinctive signature of Lucien Maxwell, emerging, as if by magic, through the surface layers of paint. The conservation treatment Blackwood had mentioned was already working, activated perhaps by the vibration of moving the paintings from their usual positions or by the change in temperature as they were prepared for transport. Reyes called Carlos over, drawing his attention to the phenomenon. He confirmed after checking several paintings that it was happening on all of them. The signatures were literally emerging through the surface. One of the FBI's art specialists suggested it was a conservation reaction, explaining that certain pigments can respond to changes in environment, revealing underlying layers that were previously invisible. Marcus Harrington watched in horror as his grandfather's fraud revealed itself in real time, the evidence of deception literally rising to the surface before multiple witnesses. As Harrington stammered in disbelief, Carlos formally advised him that in light of this development, making any further false statements regarding the provenance of these artworks could constitute obstruction of justice in an ongoing federal investigation. Harrington seemed to physically diminish, the weight of his family's multi-generational fraud finally crushing his practiced aristocratic bearing. He stated he needed to speak with his attorneys, moving away from the paintings as if they had become toxic. As the FBI team continued processing the scene, Reyes stepped outside for a moment, needing fresh air and perspective. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights, a reminder of how rarely we see what's always present but hidden by artificial illumination. Her phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number, thanking her and noting that justice had finally been served. She knew it was from Theodore Maxwell, and she didn't reply. Any response would be inadequate to address the complexity of what had transpired. An elaborate plan spanning decades, orchestrated to achieve what conventional justice had failed to deliver: recognition of a father's genius and exposure of the fraud that had buried it. Carlos joined her outside, his expression thoughtful. He observed that she knew more about this than she had shared, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Reyes met his gaze directly, emphasizing that the evidence was genuine, the fraud was real, and Lucien Maxwell had created those paintings while Marcus Harrington's grandfather stole his legacy. Those were the facts that mattered for the investigation. When Carlos asked about the rest, she described it as a story about justice that took 50 years to unfold, one that perhaps didn't need every detail documented in an official report. Carlos studied her for a long moment, before suggesting that when this was over, he'd like to hear that story off the record. Reyes agreed that maybe someday, when justice felt complete, she would share it with him. 6 months later, the Metropolitan Museum unveiled a special exhibition titled "The Maxwell Legacy: Genius Reclaimed." In the Grand Gallery, the authenticated works from the Harrington collection, minus the 13 stolen pieces that had never been recovered, hung with new attribution placards identifying Lucien Maxwell as their creator. The exhibition catalog detailed the remarkable story of their creation in the early 50s. Maxwell's pioneering techniques that perfectly captured the styles of different historical periods, and the subsequent misattribution that had buried his contribution to art history for half a century. What the catalog didn't mention were the specific circumstances that had led to this correction: the elaborate heist, the strategic manipulation of evidence, the carefully orchestrated revelation. Those details remain known only to a select few. Detective Sophia Reyes moved through the crowded opening night reception, observing the public's fascination with both the extraordinary paintings and their dramatic story. Carlos, dressed in a suit rather than his usual FBI attire, approached Reyes and offered her a glass of champagne, remarking that this was quite a triumph of historical correction. Reyes accepted the drink and reflected that justice isn't always linear, sometimes taking unexpected paths. Carlos nodded toward a striking young man across the gallery, engaged in animated conversation with several art critics, wondering if that was Jason Miller, whom he thought had disappeared after the heist. Reyes smiled slightly and suggested it must be someone else, mentioning she'd heard Miller was studying art in Europe these days. In another corner of the gallery, a distinguished older woman in an elegant black dress discreetly dabbed at her eyes as she stood before the harbor storm, now properly attributed to Lucien Maxwell. According to the small brass plaque beside her seat, the bench had been donated in memory of Theodore Maxwell, who had passed away 3 months after the revelation of his father's work. Near the exhibition's end, a small private gallery had been dedicated to Lucien Maxwell himself. Photographs, personal papers, and examples of his legitimate restoration work. In the center, protected by museum glass, lay his journal, open to the final entry from November 1956. Art endures beyond the artist. Truth waits patiently beneath the surface. Someday, someone will see what lies hidden. As Reyes prepared to leave, she noticed a tall figure in the crowd, familiar in bearing though not in appearance. The man caught her eye briefly, offering an almost imperceptible nod before continuing his examination of the music lesson. Damian Blackwood, master of disguise and reinvention, unable to resist witnessing the culmination of his work. 1 year to the day after the heist, Reyes received a package at her apartment. A small, carefully wrapped frame containing a handwritten note on expensive paper. The message was brief. Justice, like art, takes many forms. Sometimes the most beautiful are those created outside conventional boundaries. It was signed with a small, elegant wolf's head. She hung it in her home office, opposite her collection of case files and investigation notes, a reminder that justice and truth sometimes required looking beyond official narratives to the hidden signatures beneath.